I was a junior in high school when this happened. It was the last week of school, that specific stretch of days where nothing matters anymore. Finals are done, grades are locked in, and everyone is just waiting for the bell to ring on Friday afternoon so summer can officially start. Our school was a pretty standard public high school in rural Tennessee. Nothing special about it. 2 floors, a parking lot that flooded every time it rained, and a gymnasium that smelled like it hadn't been cleaned since 1987. The only thing unusual about our school was the building itself. It was old, built sometime in the 1940s, and the basement level had been completely sealed off sometime in the 1970s after a section of the floor collapsed during a renovation. Nobody went down there. The door at the bottom of the stairwell had been padlocked for as long as anyone could remember, and the stairwell itself had been blocked off with a chain-link fence that the school had installed right at the top of the stairs. The whole area smelled like mold and rust. There were stories about that basement, the way there always are about sealed-off places in old buildings. Kids said a janitor had died down there in the 1980s. Kids said you could hear knocking coming from behind the door if you pressed your ear against the chain-link fence. I never believed any of it. I'm not the type. But I also never went near that stairwell if I could help it, which is funny, considering what I ended up doing on the last day of junior year. It was my friend Marcus's idea. He was the kind of person who needed to mark every occasion with something memorable, and his idea of marking the end of junior year was getting into the sealed basement. He'd been talking about it for weeks. He said his older brother had told him there was a gap in the chain-link fence near the bottom corner that was large enough to squeeze through, and that the padlock on the basement door had been broken for years. The school just kept the chain on it to make it look locked. There were 4 of us: me, Marcus, a girl named Priya who was dating Marcus at the time, and my best friend at the time, a guy named Derek, who was the only one among us who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the whole plan, but came anyway, because that's what Derek did. He always came anyway. We stayed behind after the last bell on Friday. It wasn't hard. The teachers cleared out fast on the last day, and the hallways emptied within 20 minutes. We hid in the boys' bathroom on the 2nd floor until the building got quiet, then made our way down to the stairwell. Marcus was right about the gap in the fence. It was in the bottom left corner, bent back like someone had done it deliberately. We squeezed through one at a time and stood at the top of a staircase that smelled like standing water and old concrete. Marcus pulled out his phone flashlight and started down the stairs. The rest of us followed. The chain on the basement door was looped through the handle, but the padlock hanging off it was open. Marcus pulled the chain free and pushed the door. It swung inward with the kind of groan that old metal doors make when they haven't moved in years. The basement was enormous, way bigger than it had any right to be given the size of the building above it. There were old desks stacked in uneven piles, broken chairs, water-damaged boxes, a few rusted filing cabinets. The ceiling was low enough that Marcus had to duck slightly. The floor was concrete and slightly damp in certain spots where water had been seeping in for what looked like decades. We spread out a little and started looking around. Priya found a stack of old yearbooks from the 1960s. Derek found a box of textbooks so old the covers had completely separated from the pages. I was looking through an old filing cabinet near the back wall when Marcus called us over. He had found a door. It was set into the back wall, partially hidden behind a stack of old gymnasium equipment, folded wrestling mats, and broken volleyball net poles. The door was metal, smaller than a standard door, and it had no handle on the outside. Just a flat metal panel with a slot near the top, like a mail slot, except larger. Marcus shone his light through the slot. He pulled back immediately. I asked him what was in there. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there with a strange look on his face. Then he said, quietly, that he thought he saw something move. We all took turns looking through the slot. Inside was a small room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, completely bare except for what appeared to be a metal cot frame bolted to the wall on one side. The room smelled different from the rest of the basement. thicker somehow, heavier. The walls had dark stains on them that I couldn't identify. And Marcus was right. There was something in there. In the far corner of the room, there was a shape. It was hard to tell exactly what it was because the light from Marcus's phone only reached so far, but it looked like a pile of fabric or clothing bundled up against the wall, except it was moving, very slightly, rising and falling, like something breathing. Derek said we needed to leave. He said it in the flat, no-argument tone he used when he was serious, and Derek was almost never serious. Nobody argued with him. We moved fast, back through the door, up the stairs, through the gap in the fence, and out of the building through the side exit. We talked about it for the rest of that summer. Marcus looked up the building's history and found an old article from a local paper that mentioned the school building had previously been used as a short-term psychiatric holding facility in the 1950s before it was converted. The small room in the basement, he thought, had probably been some kind of isolation room. I thought about what was breathing in that corner for a long time after. I told myself it was probably an animal, a stray cat or a raccoon that had gotten in through some gap in the foundation. That's almost certainly what it was. But Derek never talked about that basement again. Not once for the rest of the time I knew him. And Derek talked about everything. This happened the summer after I graduated high school. I grew up in a small town in eastern Kentucky, the kind of place where summer nights revolve around whose parents are out of town and who has the biggest property. My friend group had about 10 or 12 people in it, depending on the night, and the summer after graduation, we were all newly 18 and completely invincible in the way that only teenagers who have just finished high school can be. The party was at a farm property outside of town that belonged to the family of a girl named Cassie. Her parents had gone to visit her aunt in Florida for 2 weeks, and Cassie had wasted approximately no time before organizing what she called a proper send-off for senior year. The property had a big open field behind the barn, a pond at the far end of it, and enough space that nobody within earshot could complain about noise. I got there around 9 that night with my friend Tyler. There were already maybe 30 people there by the time we arrived, which was more than I expected. Word had spread further than Cassie intended. There was a bonfire going in the middle of the field, loud music coming from someone's truck, and the general chaos that comes with a crowd of 18-year-olds who have just been set free for the summer. Everything was fine for the first couple of hours, normal party stuff. I was standing by the bonfire, talking to some people, when Tyler came over and told me something that made my stomach drop a little. He said someone was standing at the edge of the property. He pointed toward the far side of the field, away from the barn, where the property line met a stretch of tree line. It was dark out there. The bonfire lit up the immediate area, but 30 or 40 feet out, it got hard to see anything clearly. Tyler said he'd noticed it a few minutes ago. Just a figure, standing still at the edge of the trees, not moving. I looked for a while and couldn't see anything. I told him it was probably just a shadow from the fire. He said he didn't think so. About 20 minutes later, I saw it myself. It was standing just at the edge of where the firelight reached, maybe 50 feet away. A person, completely still. I couldn't make out any detail, no face, no clothing, just a silhouette. The bonfire was throwing light in the wrong direction for me to see anything clearly, but it was unambiguously a person, and they were just standing there watching the party. I pointed it out to Cassie. She squinted out at the tree line and said it was probably just someone from the party who had wandered out there. She went back to her conversation. I didn't push it, but over the next hour, I kept looking, and the figure kept being there. Same spot. Same stillness. Nobody at a party stands completely still in one spot for an hour. Nobody. I got Tyler and we walked out toward the tree line together. Not all the way. We stopped about 15 feet short of where the figure had been standing. There was nobody there. Just the edge of the tree line and the dark field beyond it. I shone my phone light along the tree line in both directions. Nothing. We walked back to the fire. I was trying to convince myself it had been exactly what Cassie said, just a party guest who had wandered out there and then come back in. It made sense. It was the reasonable explanation. Then at some point after midnight, Cassie's dog started barking from inside the barn where she'd put him at the start of the night. He was a big German shepherd named Ranger, and he was not a dog that barked without reason. Cassie went to check on him, and Tyler and I went with her. When she opened the barn door, Ranger pushed past her immediately and took off toward the tree line, barking in that focused, directed way that dogs bark when they're tracking something specific. He ran straight to the exact spot where I'd seen the figure standing. He barked at the tree line for almost 2 full minutes, then stopped abruptly and came back to us, tail low, ears back. Cassie called her neighbor, a guy in his 50s named Walt, who lived about a quarter mile down the road and knew the property well. Walt came over with a flashlight and walked the tree line. He came back about 10 minutes later and told us he'd found a spot in the trees about 30 feet in where someone had clearly been standing for a while. There were cigarette butts on the ground, several of them, old enough that whoever it was had been there before the party started. Walt told Cassie to get everyone inside the barn and call her parents. She did. The party ended fast after that. The police came and checked the area but found no one. They kept the report open. Nobody ever found out who it was or why they were standing there watching a field full of teenagers for hours. I think about Ranger running straight to that exact spot a lot. He knew. He knew the whole time. This happened the summer before my senior year of college. I was 20 years old, and I had taken a summer job at a motel about 40 minutes from my university in Central Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work. I worked the front desk from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., checked people in, handled complaints, and occasionally cleaned rooms when the housekeeping staff left for the day. The motel was a small, independent place, maybe 40 rooms arranged in 2 L-shaped rows facing a parking lot. The kind of place that got mostly highway travelers and the occasional long-term guest renting by the week. I was about 3 weeks into the job when a man checked in who I'll call Room 114. I'm going to call him that because that's all I knew about him for most of the time he was there. He paid cash for a week's stay, which was unusual but not unheard of. He gave a name I couldn't find any record of when I looked him up later. He had no car that I ever saw in the parking lot. He came and went on foot, always from the same direction, and always between late afternoon and late at night. He was quiet. He never complained about anything. He never asked for extra towels or called the front desk. In a normal motel, a quiet guest who pays cash and causes no trouble is a good guest. But there was something about him that I couldn't shake from the first night he checked in. It was the way he looked at me when he signed the check-in form. Most guests glance up at you once, maybe twice. He looked at me the entire time he was at the desk. Not in an obvious staring way, just steady, like he was studying something. By the 3rd day, I started noticing things. The housekeeping staff mentioned that when they went to clean his room, he always had the "Do Not Disturb" sign out, which was allowed for up to 3 days without an exception form. On the 4th day, per motel policy, someone had to enter regardless. My manager Linda asked me to do a welfare check since the housekeeper didn't want to go alone and Linda had a bad knee. I knocked and announced myself 3 times before using the master key. The room was dark. Every curtain pulled completely shut. The bed had been slept in, but not recently, like the sheets had been disturbed and then left that way for days. The bathroom was clean. There were no personal items visible anywhere. No bags, no clothing, no toiletries on the bathroom counter. The only thing in that room that didn't belong to the motel was a single photograph on the bedside table. It was facing away from me, toward the wall. I turned it over before I thought better of it. It was a photograph of the motel, taken from the parking lot. You could see the front desk window clearly in the photograph, the light on inside, the counter, the computer screen. And standing behind the counter, visible through the window, was me. I set the photograph down and left the room. I went straight to Linda and told her what I'd found. She called the police. They came and searched the room and found nothing else out of the ordinary. The photograph was taken as evidence. They ran the name he'd given at check-in and came back with nothing useful. It was a common name, and the address he'd provided didn't exist. By the time any of this was processed, it was past his checkout date. He never came back for his key. He never checked out formally. He was just gone. The officer who handled the report told me the photograph had probably been taken from the parking lot sometime in the previous few days, using a zoom lens or a phone camera with a good zoom function. He said there was nothing technically illegal about taking a photograph from a public parking lot, but that the intent behind it, combined with the false identity and cash payment, made it concerning enough to flag. I finished out that summer job. I told myself I had no reason to quit over something that was ultimately unresolved and probably would stay that way. But I moved my car to a different spot in the parking lot every single night after that. I made sure I couldn't be seen from the front window when I was at the desk, and I never worked a closing shift alone again. I still don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been watching before he checked in. I don't know why he left the photograph face down on the bedside table rather than taking it with him. Maybe he wanted me to find it. Maybe he left in a hurry and forgot it. I've thought about both of those possibilities many times. Neither one of them makes me feel better.